Discerning Hearts presents In Search of the Still Point with Dr. Regis Martin. In this episode, Dr. Martin reflects on the Homage to the Holy Trinity.
Besides being one of the happiest countries on earth, this, despite 5 active volcanoes and having to live next door to Nicaragua, Costa Rica, which is only a 3-hour flight from Miami, provides 187 vacation days, and that may explain why everyone's so happy. Most of these, of course, are religious holidays. And isn't that an arresting thought? That any time you grab a calendar to see if you've got the right date, chances are it's a feast day, which means that even if you don't get the day off, you're still free to celebrate. But what are we expected to celebrate? Well, what about this, which is the persisting theme of every feast, namely the fact that God is with us. Indeed, he is a being so intensely, intimately with us that there is no way he would walk away. From the miracle of his conception in the womb of Mary, to the mystery of his birth in Bethlehem, to the abject misery of his being nailed to the cross, to the sheer majesty of his rising from the dead, and all the feasts that fall between, God is always on the side of those whom he most ardently and deeply loves. Yes, but how can this be unless that little word, with, were not somehow already contained in God's own being, a profoundly constitutive feature, in other words, of the very being of the Godhead, a defining feature, I am saying, of who God is from all eternity. When we read that incomparable fragment, for example, from T.S. Eliot's 4 Quartets, about the wounded surgeon who plies the steel that questions the distempered part, beneath whose bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art, resolving the fever chart. We ask ourselves, well, where does all of this come from? This capacity shown by Christ to evince a compassion so radical and comprehensive as to be with us even in our brokenness. And the answer, of course, is found in the fact that Christ's own being is that of being with, that is, being with the Father, who from all eternity speaks his name, and when, in mutual thanksgiving, they unite, they breathe forth the Holy Spirit. All of which means that he is able to be the man for others in time and history, only because he is first a being with God in eternity and in mystery, so that on the strength of a unity and intimacy so absolute and unending, he may then venture forth in search of his lost creation. That taking leave of the precincts of eternal felicity, he is then free to enter into a state of being with us, who would otherwise languish forever in a state of sheer, meaningless misery. God cannot suffer in himself, St. Bernard of Clairvaux reminds us, but he can do so with and in us. Indeed, he is always on the side of the suffering, which is why the fact that he stayed on the cross until the very end tells us all we need to know about God's solidarity with those who sin and suffer. God is not a sealed fortress, says Hans Urs von Balthasar, to be attacked and seized by our engines of war, which is to say, ascetic practices, meditative techniques, and the like, but a house full of open doors through which we are invited to walk, in the castle of the three-in-one The plan has always been that we, who are entirely other, shall participate in the superabundant communion of God's own life. Saint Hildegard gives us a lovely example of this, by the way. She writes that in every word there is sound, sense, and spiration. The Father has the sound, that it may be heard, meaning that it may be understood, and breath, that it may be pronounced. In the sound we hear, then, we observe the Father, who manifests all things with ineffable power. And in the meaning, we have the Word, the Son, who was miraculously begotten of the Father, who speaks his name forever. And of course, in the breath, the spiration, we have the Holy Spirit, who sweetly burns in the other two. Therefore, in these three persons, we recognize our God, the one who created us in the power of his divinity and then set about redeeming us when all fell into grief and shipwreck. And how else can all of this happen, I am saying, this experience of being unendingly with God, taken up by God, cleaving forever to his being, unless he were himself and right down to the bottom of his bucket, pure, eternal being with. Thanks for listening, and happy feast of the Blessed Trinity. This is Regis Martin in search of the still point.
You've been listening to Dr. Regis Martin in search of the still point. For more episodes in this series, visit discerninghearts.com, or you can find it in our free Discerning Hearts app or on many other streaming platforms. Discerning Hearts is a 501c3 nonprofit Catholic apostolate dedicated to evangelization and spiritual formation through the use of new media. To learn how you can support our mission, visit discerninghearts.com.